Argentina is a country in South America of more than 4 million square kilometers and a population of 35 million. Its relationship with Ireland dates back to 1588, when the King of Spain, in recognition of Ireland's aid during the Spanish Armada, prohibited any non-Irish foreigner to emigrate to Argentina. Subsequently, thousands of Irish came to settle, and their descendants currently number over 500,000. This is a brief account of Argentine history. From 1976 to 1983, years during which the country was governed by a military dictatorship. As in many periods of the history of Argentina, this one is stained with the blood of Irish descendants that arrived in hopes of escaping hunger and political and religious persecution.
What happened during those years is not ordinary, but it's also not part of, oh, South America's like that. This is the way life is conducted here. Argentina is a very different sort of country. It has certain traditions, such as, you know, years when there's a free press. It has a huge educated population. But in these years, what happened was surrounded by silence. That it wasn't reported in the press. That individual families felt that they were alone in trying to deal with this. That there was no, in a way, no national knowledge of this until much later. And of course, anyone knew that if you stepped out of line, that if you moved into the firing line, that they would take anybody. And slowly, of course, a climate of huge fear built up in this country. But what I'm saying is that what happened in those years was political.
My name is Kevin O'Neill, and I was born here. My family's from here, but my mother was Irish. She was born and came from Ardee, County Louth. And my father was of Irish origin also.
My name is Pat Rice. I was born in Ireland in Fermoy, County Cork, just the same year that the war ended in 1945.
The story of what happened in those cells, in those buildings all over the city. And of course, I was new in the city. So when I saw a street name, I would recognize that, oh, that's the street where so-and-so was captured. That's the street where the body was left. Or that's the street where there was a famous place of torture where a lot of people were taken to.
In this very room, a terrible crime occurred.
I think the context is really important, that this was the mid-70s. It was only 16 or 17 years after Castro and Che Guevara had taken power in Cuba with an army of just 200 people. That I think it's also important that anyone in Argentina, as in other places, who studied things like sociology or psychology or philosophy or even literature or even medicine, had very strong views about things like the Vietnam War, the economic power of the United States and the future of Argentina. And I think this is extremely important to remember, that that's a very different time when that sort of ideology, which some of it was Marxist, some of it was less than Marxist, but certainly all of it viewed the possibility of real change within this society as something that was going to happen and could happen easily, and something that could happen perhaps best by a small armed group organized and causing it. So it starts there somewhere, and this is the context.
'75, '76, the political situation in Argentina had deteriorated absolutely of a way which is very difficult to describe. There was a big, great expectation that finally when Perón came back in 1973, first of all, the whole question of Perón was something which is very Argentine, and at that time was something which everybody, a lot of people felt. He had been thrown out of government, the military had taken over, he'd been put into exile, and it's certainly around his figure there was a lot of hope being generated, hope for progress, for development, for justice and everything else, and became a sort of a charismatic figure in exile.
It's very difficult to remember that context. You know, certainly in Ireland, it tended to be people from the working class areas of the cities or from poor parts of Northern Ireland who joined, for example, the IRA. But here, because of what had happened in Cuba, it was more the people who became montoneros, for example, or the leadership, were much more people from universities. It's very hard to think where one would have been situated at that time, but certainly anyone who studied literature or who thought about that, you know, who was young at that time with the Vietnam War in full swing, certainly believed that the power of the United States was not good for Argentina.
Until finally in 1975 I came to live in Buenos Aires in our community, and we began a small community in a shanty town which is right within the city of Buenos Aires, in a place called Soldati, Villa Soldati. It was a shanty town, it was about 15,000 people. Now shanty town is a place where people who come into the city and look around for some place to put a house, at least to build something which they can sleep in. So this particular area of the shanty town was built outside in a part of Buenos Aires, which was, Buenos Aires is a very flat type of city, and parts of it a little bit towards the suburb was not moving out from Buenos Aires, where the land was low and it was all traditionally being used, been filled up with garbage and with rubbish. And this area of Soldati was an area which, well, there was a lot of rubbish piles and dumps. And then as the time went on, people began to inhabit them, and then the sort of began squatting, and this was what happened. This was still remember the first house we had there. Well, it was the only house we had with another priest. It cost us £20. That was about $30 at that stage. It was a sort of a structure of a house with 4 or 5, with each wall was made of a sort of a cardboard, with tarred cardboard so that the rain couldn't come in.
I think it's very difficult for anybody, say in Ireland, to understand what it was like here then. I think that terrorism always produces a sort of paranoia in governments. The governments never know what to do. How far do they have to go to protect the state from these people? But here the difference was, I think, that there was, where everything in Ireland was reported, for example, internment, say, became an enormous issue because the press made it an enormous issue. It didn't just happen to people with no one else knowing it happened. People were taken in the morning, and the next day there were massive reports in all the newspapers, including the English newspapers, about what had happened. Here there was simply silence. Here you could simply go to someone's house, take the person away, and there would be only silence. And because the families of the people, because this was a new generation brought up in a completely different way, studying the texts of, say, Marx or Marcuse, or indeed Che Guevara, that their parents were not involved in any way in their politics. So there was a huge generation gap here in those years. So simply the parents went to the police. Someone has taken our daughter. Could you help us? And the police, of course, had taken their daughter, or indeed the army or the navy, or indeed the Air Force had taken their daughter. But the families, the parents, still believed that this was a normal society. Nothing appeared in the newspapers. The families continued to go to the police, and there simply was an aura, an atmosphere of immense silence surrounding what happened. So when things began, there was, I mean, it is possible to believe people when they say that simply they didn't know it was happening at that time.
So we were working in this area at the same time as I was a worker priest, so it meant this movement, Brothers of Charles de Foucauld, is a movement which is recognized by Rome, by the Vatican. It's an official congregation, so to speak, within the Catholic Church, just as the Jesuits, the Dominicans, the Salesians, but of course much smaller, really. So we were allowed work. I was working in the building as an Irishman and probably inevitably falls into the building trade. Coming also from a farming background, it wasn't very difficult for me to get involved in building. And so I used to work at building and working in a company. And then at night or during weekends, attending this community in terms of mass, in terms of Bible groups and other types of groups. So this was the type of activity we were doing.
Once things began, they never stopped. So, you know, while at the beginning they had suspicions about certain people or evidence about other people, once they began to work, it became an almost full-time occupation. So anyone with any sort of associations, including, for example, a group of secondary school students who decided to band together because they thought there should be lower bus fares for secondary school students. And this was the only politics they had. They were also taken in, and most of those were also murdered. So while it began with, you know, suspicion and evidence, it became enormous. I mean, it really became that anyone was liable to be taken in, but they tended to be young, idealistic, and well-educated.
So the opinion was that the men who actually carried out the deed were belonging to the Navy or the Air Force.
I think one of the reasons why I chose Argentina as well is that both in Ireland in the 60s and in the seminary became involved in the ecumenical movement. There was a general movement of renewal in the Church of the Vatican Council, Pope John the 23rd, and then there was also a lot of concern about the Third World, about poverty. And in Ireland, we had the problem of the whole civil rights movement, which was just beginning at that time. And in a certain sense, I become involved, not very involved, but as one could within a seminarian type of structure, become involved in that type of movement. So I did have a lot of concerns about peace, justice, rights, human rights, civil rights, we called them at that time.
Well, the whole time we wanted to know why they were chosen, why they were killed in such a horrible way.
Argentina is a predominantly Catholic country. Incoming presidents swear on the Bible to uphold the Constitution. The Catholic Church firmly and consciously supported the military government, as it did in Chile under Pinochet. The Church was fully aware of what was occurring. They knew about the concentration camps and knew that citizens were being imprisoned, tortured, and killed without judicial process. They never denounced this practice. Had they done so, the lives of thousands of innocent people would have been saved. This policy of silence can only be regarded as complicity.
What happened here was really astonishing, and it's very hard to compare it to anything. That once they began to take people in, they tortured them, and eventually they murdered them. And the tortures went on and on over weeks and weeks. Often they raped them. The stories of what happened to people, to a man and a woman finding that they were blindfolded and they could see nobody, and hearing screams one night and realizing that those screams were the screams of their son. He was somewhere in the building, their son was in the building as well. But of course they couldn't take the blindfolds off. And women who were raped all the time, men who were raped all the time. And of course, because they were all young, these people, a lot of the women were pregnant, or at least a good number of the women were pregnant and had their babies, under these conditions. And the babies were all stolen. And this is an extraordinary idea that all over this country, in various places, people got babies. And people from the military tended to get the babies. And they had no children themselves. They wanted a child, and they got this little baby. And they brought the child up as though it was their child, but it wasn't their child. It was a child stolen from someone that they had been torturing. Now, they came to your house. They generally came at night. They often stole every single thing in the house, down to the light bulb. And everyone who gave evidence, you were sitting in the court listening, everyone who gave evidence said, they didn't just take my daughter away, they took my sewing machine away, they took my television away. And in one case, a man said, look, a torturer came to him and said, look, my wife has your sewing machine. She has real trouble with working. Could you tell me, what do you do at that point with your sewing machine? Talking to him as though they were sort of almost friends. And the description then of the tortures, they tended to use cattle prods. In other words, that's what they have here. It's a big cattle country. They had these cattle prods, and they ran them all over people's bodies, inside their mouths, on their genitals, and they did this day after day after day, and they did this to a very large number of people. It's very difficult to work out the numbers, but you're certainly talking in tens of thousands, and probably up to something like 100,000 people detained or brought in at some point or other, and perhaps 30,000 altogether murdered. I mean, it isn't just there was no control. It does seem that a great number of people during those years dedicated themselves full-time to this activity, that it became what the military did, what the Navy did, and what the Air Force did, almost full-time.
Five members of our congregation were brutally murdered shooting by being shot in the back. They were defenseless and innocent.
We were walking out along the street when suddenly we sort of saw lights coming at us and, driving very hard, the lights. It was dark at that time. It was in October, the 11th of October, which in Argentina sort of is spring. Next thing, we had this voice, and this man sort of, because he left the lights on, pointing at it, he said, "Stop or I'll shoot." And we sort of stopped and said, "Give us your documents." You know, in Argentina, you have to have sort of an ID card, which is obligatory, and the usual police procedure, particularly at that time, there was a state of siege and everything else, was a tense type of situation. Somebody came again and says, "Well," he says, "it's too bad for you. We're going to send you to the army." And now you can be damn well sure that you're going to understand what that the Roman soldiers didn't know anything about making Christians suffer when you see what the Argentinian army are going to do to you.
Murder the priest, murder the community, were sent to do that. No? So who sent them?
I think what was really astonishing in the evidence given to the trial and in all the evidence that has emerged is the sheer barbarity of what occurred, is just the level of cruelty and hatred and the feeling that nobody would ever be responsible. And you know, in the years afterwards, even in the early years of democracy and even now, you can hear people saying, well, you know, it was a difficult time. You know, these men had to run the country. These young people were really, you know, a terrorist group. And what happened, you know, had its reasons. That it isn't as though, you know, everybody now realizes that, you know, that this was completely wrong and that it was the very worst thing that happened here. There are still significant elements in this society who believe that what happened in those years, that what the dictatorship did and all the violence and murders had its reasons. And there is still in this society, and has been almost from the beginning, a sort of business about being a strong military man, about standing apart from everybody, especially apart from women. And that, I mean, it's significant, the number of women who were murdered, or the number of women who were tortured. That this business that somehow, in the early years of the creation of this country, it was created through war, through battles, and through the creation of a sort of military superstructure that has never really gone away. And I think that's extreme and still remains, that these men genuinely believed that what they were doing was right, that they genuinely believed that they had to eradicate this sort of, this new generation almost, or all these young, super educated people with their Marx and their Marcuse and their belief in Castro. They genuinely believed that they were doing their patriotic duty. And this is a country where people will still talk about patriotic duty. They genuinely believed this. And there are elements still that genuinely still believe that what they did was, well, it's hard to say right.
So then after a short while, I was taken out and put sitting on something which seemed sort of a foamy type of bed. I'd been in bed because afterwards I was made to lie down, but at first it seemed just sort of like a chair. And they said to me, well, we're going to change your hood, you know, but you bloody well not look at us, because if that's you're a goner, the fellow says. So no. So anyway, they changed and put a small sort of a type of band on. He said, well, he said, I was of course handcuffed behind my back. So they said, well, lie back. And sort of lied back and said, well, you're involved with subversion groups, you know all the subversion. I said, no. And next thing they began beating me with sort of karate blows down across the chest, and at the same time, I don't remember, I don't know if it was a sort of a teapot or a kettle of water, or if it was, in fact, a hose or something like that, they began putting water into my mouth and beating me, so I became sort of asphyxiated. And I didn't really understand what was happening, which is, I mean, here sort of a violence as if, you know, somebody, you know, had decided that they had to destroy me.
I think that in Ireland all the time during the years of the Troubles, there was always a huge debate going on about, you know, was it right, was it wrong, what was happening? You know, each side was constantly on television, radio, and the press arguing every point. And that all the deaths were marked in some way, that the funerals and the rituals and the condemnations and the grief was all done in public. But even still in Northern Ireland, there are still a few families who cannot find the people who are dead. They don't know where the bodies are. Mainly, these were people who were murdered by the IRA, and they still want the IRA to tell them where are the bodies of our families. There are not very many cases of this, but it still lingers. Can you imagine here that there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people who simply do not know how their loved ones were murdered, when they were murdered, where they were murdered, or where the bodies are. They simply still do not know. They do not have that essential information about what were the last days like, or just where are they now. And they still don't know that. And that is something that still festers here.
I couldn't understand really much of what was happening. So then after a short while, lying in that position, of course, I couldn't incorporate, I couldn't sit up again. So they sort of took advantage of the situation to put handcuffs on my feet. So they then sort of dragged me. I was dragged out into some sort of a place, and my feet were handcuffed to something on the wall. So I was kept in that position for about, I don't know, 24 hours now, how long ago.
I can't be bothered with one person because we're so busy, you know, we're just getting these bodies and throwing them into the sea. But he thought that was a figure of speech. He actually believed that was just a way of describing what they did. But it turned out that that's what they were in fact doing. That on certain days of the week, they would take the drugged bodies of these people, still alive, and take them out over the South Atlantic and simply drop them from planes down into the sea. And this is how a great number of bodies were disposed of. But other bodies were disposed of in other ways. So, for example, there are mass graves in this country.
So they started tying me down to, it must have been, I don't know, they tied my hands and my feet and began putting on cables. Now they put on a cable on my foot, and they put other cables, I think it was, onto my hands. And then they put a lot of water as well. It says, you know, so you're going to give us the information we want. We want to know, you know, who was involved in the shanty town, in subversive organizations who are working against the military, who are involved with, at that stage, I wanted to know of the Montoneros group, of who involved in everything else. Of course, you know, working in that area, I knew a lot of people. I knew that the group existed. I knew people that were working, but I mean, here we were in a military dictatorship. I wasn't damn well going to give them any information, because I mean, any information meant that they would do the same. And anyway, they had no legitimacy. It was a military government. I mean, what are they talking about? So with that, something must move the switch, but suddenly sort of found all this electricity going to another. The thing about the sensation of electricity is that it goes through you, and sort of you lose control of your body.
different theories. A few days before the crime, someone placed a bomb in the dining room of the officers of the federal police in their seat of their authority in the center of the city, and that killed about 15 high-ranking members of the police. So that those holding power, generally they're all military men, but there were amongst them, some of them more aggressive or more radical, say, than the others. There was what they would call like the doves, and those who look for peaceful means to assert their authority, and others that were more extremist. And they came and proposed to the junta itself, to give them a fortnight, 10 days or a fortnight, and they would clear the whole city of all intents, of all of all opposition. Naturally, such a measure would create horror in the people, and also it would damage the good name of the country in the exterior. So it seems they started with that plan that night. Now, why did they include in the opposition this community precisely? One reason was that the only entity, the only institution that could make a public cry would be the church. Press was dumb. Press was there were no other ways or means left under the state of siege that we were living. So there would be. So it was a kind of a warning to the church that you be careful, because you are not exempted from this. And that was proved later by the criminal death of a bishop of La Rioja, Monsignor Angelelli, who was shot exactly on the 4th of August, 1 month later. Another priest who were also cruelly murdered in the interior of the country. And it was done in this parish, Sympathy, because it's such a prominent parish, in the heart of a district that is well known, and it couldn't be silenced, so that everyone would get to know. It wasn't done in some dark part of the city, in some of the emergency places, or in the distant interior, but we're in the heart of the city. The Pallotines were well known.
Well, you've been arrested, and you've been accused of cooperating with subversion. I said I refuse. I deny that accusation. He says, well, that's too bad for you. After that time, I was taken back again, and then I was finally that evening taken away in the car once again to the Central Police Station, where so that began for me, one could say, it was almost 2 months of official detention. It wasn't a Central Police Station, and it was after about 3 or 4 days which I was taken out and shaven and perfumed and all sorts. I wonder what the hell's going on here. Then taken upstairs on a lift with two, of course there everything was done blindfolded. You weren't supposed to see anybody. So I had an eye very badly beaten. So just be going into a room, one says, you know, take off his blindfold, won't you? So I took off my blindfold, went in, and there was the ambassador, Irish ambassador Wilfred Lennon, looking at me. I said, my God, Pat, that's great to see anyway, you're alive. I said, yes. Justin Harmer, the secretary, was there as well. And well, so we got speaking, and so it was after that really the ambassador, I thanked him for his consent, because I mean, I think one has to really remember, I think he was one of the few European ambassadors who sort of practically managed to salvage somebody out of our secret detention center, torture camp at that time.
How all this came to an end was not a sort of national uprising saying you cannot continue to do this to our children. How this came to an end was the Falklands War. That, you see, if you lived here in those years, you didn't read the newspapers because the newspapers were all lies, and you didn't listen to national radio or television because there was nothing on national radio or television that was in any way interesting or true. You simply lived a private life and you heard rumors. But the Falklands War changed everything because suddenly something was in the newspapers, on radio, that was true, that Argentina had invaded the Falkland Islands. And so suddenly you could talk to your neighbor about politics, because before you had to be very careful with your neighbor about politics because you didn't know who your neighbor knew or what your neighbor would say. So you would say nothing to your neighbor about the dictatorship or the disappearances or the rumors. You would live in a sort of silence. But with the Falklands War, you could stop your neighbor and say, hey, what do you think of the Falklands War? You could go out onto the street, and people on the street were all talking. Suddenly, a whole new way of playing, you know, private and public life here changed. People could walk onto the street. People could go down to the square, to the Plaza de Mayo, and stand there and be a citizen of this state for once. So the Falklands War changed everything because it let people talk. It gave people an interest in what was happening publicly. It ended the silence. And, you know, it is interesting to think, just say Argentina had won the war, it would have been very difficult for the dictators to have put everybody back into their box, to have silenced everybody another time. But of course, Argentina didn't win the war. So suddenly, the failure of the dictatorship was something that couldn't be kept silent. It was something that everybody could talk about to everybody else. So obviously it meant the end of the dictatorship and the beginning of democracy in Argentina.
While the military government ruled, there was a kind of a formal inquisition investigation by one of the ordinary judges of the city, you know, for criminal cases, but it was never finished, you know, and it was dragged on and on and on. Democracy was restored in 1983. the case was opened with a different judge, and some progress was made, but after was stopped by two laws that were passed then. One was called the punto final, as it put a final stop to all these questions and trials that have been going on, and a general amnesty given to all those who participated.
And so what happened in those years in this country, I also thought that if you have one trial and you just tried the people at the top and you say, look, after this trial we'll have nothing. So all the facts will be known and the main perpetrators at the top will be imprisoned or indeed perhaps maybe innocent in certain ways. I believed at that time that that would be enough, that the society could not continue forever going over this thing that happened. But I no longer believe that. I believe that the wound here is still festering. That the idea that the what's called punto final, that beyond a certain date, that you must stop, for example, arresting them or looking for evidence, that you must simply forget about all this. It simply will not go away here. That whatever wounds it has left, not just for the people involved or their families, but for the whole society who realized this was happening all around them. That somehow they had trained themselves not to get involved, not to look, not to see, not to notice, not to say anything to anybody. That the whole society somehow had become complicit in this. And obviously the perpetrators, the people who actually ran the cattle prods or brought the airplanes out of the South Atlantic are walking around this city now. People know who they are. They're freely wandering around. And this is still a huge problem here, and something that still, even after whatever, some of these events occurred 20 years ago, but even still, it's something that will not go away here. It lingers here, and I really don't know at what point the society will be able to say, this is the past, we must put it behind us, we must go on.
5 members of our congregation were brutally murdered, by being shot in the back. They were defenseless and innocent. Father Alfred Leiden was the superior, the local superior, and Father Alfie Kelly was the parish priest of St. Patrick's, and Father Peter Dufault, one of our senior priests. The other 2 were students, Salvador Barbeito, professed member of the society, and Emilio Barletti, who was a postulant.
The murders of the Palotinos was a warning to those aligned with theology of liberation and other progressive movements within the Catholic Church. It effectively enabled the Argentine church authorities to purge these influences, as were the wishes of Pope John Paul II. Following the murders, more than 200 priests fled Argentina. This same brutal policy towards the theology of liberation was applied by the Pope throughout Latin America, from Mexico to Argentina, thereby shedding all opposition to the neoliberal policy that after more than 20 years has resulted in increasing poverty and social exclusion.
beginning, from the very first, the community and the relatives, the members of the families of those who were killed, forgave the killers and forgave them, didn't seek any punishment for them, but they wanted to know the reason, because they were accused of helping the terrorists of the left, and on that account they were murdered. So there was a kind of an excuse, not a justification, but at least an excuse or a kind of an explanation of the reasons. In other words, that the community itself was to blame. This affected the good name and the honor of the dead, and they could not defend themselves. So it was up to us, their respective families, and they are our brothers in faith and the community, to stand up for them and explain, and seek not revenge, but seek an explanation that will clear the members and their good name and the good name of the society, of our community, from such accusations that were never made public, but were currently within the church and within society in general, and even within the Irish community here.
To this date, the assassins of the Palottino priest have not been brought to justice, and it's unlikely that the perpetrators, whose names are known, will ever be prosecuted.